Good morning, afternoon, or whatever time it is that you will see this program at. I'm David Norlin. We're here on the PUOP program with some perspectives of observant people. And I am extremely pleased to have with us the head of the Kansas National Education Association here in Salina, Brandon Cheeks, to my right, and Bill Hall, Superintendent of USD 305, to my left. As we talked about before we began, we expect this to be an extremely freewheeling conversation and an informative one for the public. We are here at a junction of a really, I have to say personally, I taught for 35 years before retirement, and I cannot recall in my teaching career, nor since retirement, a time when for the state of Kansas, the state of education was more vitally both at risk and at issue, and so dependent on the public to understand and act on what they see. So we have agreed, and I was sort of joking with Superintendent Hall that you may or may not be able to see it, but Mr. Cheeks, Brandon Cheeks, had on his ID badge, and Superintendent Hall didn't. And I said, "Oh, I see, you're so well known, you don't need that." And you said?
So I left it out in my vehicle.
Yeah, that's right. He's not going to be shackled with that thing the whole time. So, at any rate, just, and I promise them I will not monopolize the conversation. I will strive for that. But part of this freewheeling conversation is that not only are we looking at what's happened in Kansas, but to the degree to which it reflects nationwide trends that are not in the best interests of public education. We have, and we'll talk about this at length, particularly Brandon, about a loss of due process rights, not tenure, but due process, that has been in effect since 1957, the better part of 60 years in Kansas, and has been a part of the history of every school teacher and every person involved in education. It's just been part of the terrain, and he'll talk further about that. We also have as part of that, and I want to quote Diane Ravitch, who is a critic of education generally, and she talks about this: without a right to a fair hearing, for example, teachers might be sure that if they teach or say the word evolution in a district where they don't want to hear about evolution, then that may be a firing charge or a dismissal charge. They have no right to a hearing. It's that simple. And if those of you who read Huckleberry Finn, Invisible Man, The Grapes of Wrath, if someone out there feels they're risky and controversial and they are let go, they have no recourse to bring that to a public forum. And as Ravitch says, now is exactly when the children of Kansas in the U.S. should be reading 1984 and Brave New World. And I suspect many of those of you well-educated folk out there have looked at those at least. So not to go on and on about that, but what is important, I think, in this discussion we'll come back to is the influence of money and of forces that want to see a particular kind of education that may be different, it seems to me are different than the kind of public education we have had in Kansas for years. And I highly respect the system that we have had in Kansas. No matter how, we have consistently in Kansas scored high in performance, particularly in regard to the resources allocated to it. Mm-hmm. And I think that both my fellow panelists would agree.
Yes.
So with that, we'll come back to all this later. But Brandon, let me turn it over to you. And would you talk a little bit about the effects on teachers of House Bill 2506, I believe?
House Bill 2506, it really harmed just the teaching process in general. With due process being taken away, I've had numerous teachers come concerned, especially the older teachers. Their concern said, I've had comments, why don't they just get rid of me and hire some younger, cheaper teachers that's coming in the workforce? So some are afraid of that. Some feel like they can't say anything in opposition to the administrators about, say for instance, we have a new strategy coming in place and they've taught a different strategy for many, many years, and they felt that strategy might work better for a group of kids that come in the class, and they're afraid to maybe voice that opinion about that, or just concerns with advocating for kids. If the principal feels one way about a student not being able to voice their opinion about it, they're afraid that they can just get let go right away. So that's one of the biggest effects that I've seen just right off the bat. I've had many teachers just coming concerned about their job and their future
And not to interrupt, but to interject that in my experience, the enriching part of the classroom experience was the place where it's you and a group of young people in a classroom talking about ideas that matter to you. Yes, we exchange ideas. The model is that teachers dispense information, but a lot of times, as you know, we get back some kind of information from kids as well. It becomes that kind of learning environment.
Yes.
And the chilling of that learning environment, I hear you describing, and I'm concerned also about that.
Yes, sir. We just, in the classroom, it's us and the kids. The representatives, they're not in the classroom seeing each and every day what we see in the classroom and know the stories of the backgrounds of the kids. So, sometimes we hear things and it's very sad and tragic, the background of these kids and their lives.
Right.
So
Right.
it hurts to know that, if a kid comes to tell me this one particular thing that's going on in their family life, and I go and tell the principal or whoever, hey, this is happening, I feel this is going to be better for the kid if they don't see it the same way I do, and I just keep pushing and pushing the issue, I believe that's what the teachers are concerned about.
Is your concern the administrator in this case might not want to handle that and so just ignore it?
Or not, I'm not saying ignore it, but
Yeah.
if we don't see eye to eye.
About how to handle it?
Yes.
Yes.
And we have some good administrators in USD 305. I can say this until July.
We say that with all due respect, right?
Yeah, with all,
And more than due respect.
yeah, I'm just saying, just in general, these are the concerns
Right.
of teachers.
Right.
Some teachers that may not have seen eye to eyes with their administrators in the past, that's the first thing they came and said, I know I haven't seen eye to eye with the administrator, maybe they're just gonna let me go now. So those are just the major concerns with that policy of House Bill 2506 that I've seen.
Okay. Anything other than that as far as effects on teachers that you want to refer to, even briefly before we?
That's been the major issue. I really want to just get it out that NEA, Salina, KNEA, we are all for the funding part of this, but just didn't like the adding of the policy on top of it. The icing on the cake for some of the representatives in Topeka that we feel just it was uncalled for, unwarranted to include that into this bill. I was excited when they said, hey, we're going to fund more to education, and I've been pushing for that for many years because we need it in the public education setting.
Right. And I think it's important to note, and I think most people who follow this know this, but I know at least 2 teachers in this USD as well as several in my former, in Concordia, where I was before. In fact, I think the president of UD 114 is from there. And they were out in force in the legislature till the late hours of the night. And at 4 a.m. on a Sunday morning, this came forward. And there's a long sausage-making process about legislation. But the main point that is made accurately by the National Education Association here in Kansas is that none of these, particularly due process, none of this was hashed out and taken to a vote in front of the entire legislature. And in fact, the vote in the House was 63 to 60, just a bare shade. So it tells you also how crucial public understanding both of legislators and the public is, because it doesn't take very much to switch it.
Yes, sir.
I've also heard that there are some deficiencies with the funding formula, but I'm going to turn this over to Bill Hall, and do you want to talk about the funding provisions?
Sure, absolutely. And I would like just to follow up on a few of Brandon's comments, because I absolutely agree with what Brandon is saying. And I was on the phone that weekend, all weekend long, with one of our local representatives, and asking her to please vote no on that particular measure, even though funding was tied to it. There was a bigger issue at stake, and the issue, it had to do with due process, but it also had to do with the way they went about it. It was just not the right way to do things. It never was introduced in committee. It never had hearings. It never hit the floor of either house for debate. And then at the midnight hour, we decided to put in this provision on eliminating due process rights for teacher, a right that teachers have had for, I believe, 56 years, a long time. And so that part of it bothered me. immensely. Now,
And in classrooms, we are teaching democracy, democratic
Correct.
procedure,
Correct.
how we all work together,
Yes.
and yet this perverted that very process.
I was just appalled at how that came about and how that ended up being passed. And then when you start talking midnight hour and you start there's a lot of politics behind closed doors, and it just kind of left a sour taste in your mouth. You know?
And it should be noted that just a day or two before this, I believe, shortly before this, at the encouragement of Governor Brownback, the legislature voted 40-0 in the Senate for a bill for transparency and clear transparency among public documents with the public, and then this seemingly a 90-degree contradiction to that very principle.
Interesting the way that works sometimes, but along those lines, then what's interesting about this is when I do have folks that refer to House Bill 2506 as a school funding bill. In reality, I don't see it as a school funding bill. It has school funding in it, but they decided to come in compliance with the Supreme Court's order on equitability. They decided that they would use House Bill 2506 as the vehicle by which to meet the Supreme Court's order, and they did that.
And when we talk about equitability, Bill, explain a little bit about what that means among districts, right?
Sure, absolutely. Among districts across the state of Kansas. And a lot of folks, we have 286 school districts in the state of Kansas. And if you go to any part of the state of Kansas, and having been out in extreme western Kansas for about 16 years, and northwestern Kansas, I've been pretty much all over the state, I guarantee you every part of the state and every school district is different. They're different in terms of the demographics that they represent. They're different in terms of the property wealth that they serve.
Right.
And the fact that they're different creates inequitabilities within the system. Right. So the only way to level that playing field is that the state needs to provide additional funding for those districts who qualify to level that playing field so that every child, doesn't matter if you're in Atwood in extreme northwestern Kansas or liberal extreme southwest or Salina, or in the Kansas City, Kansas area, every student, every child in the state of Kansas should have the same opportunity for success. That's what that basis of equitability is based on.
And you know, I want to refer to a school district that sort of shares our common background, because we were both in southwest Kansas at one time. I was in Garden City at the community college there.
Right.
But, and my point, let me make it real quickly, that equitability standard may change from time to time depending on the wealth of the district. So it's an adjustable thing.
Absolutely, it's a moving target.
Right.
And the problem that we've had with this is there were two areas that the court came in and said that the state, you have not fulfilled your constitutional duty because they had not funded what we call the local option budget. Now we have additional budget that we're able to raise locally with our taxpayers, a certain percentage of our general fund. For us, we have it maxed at 30%. So 30% of our general fund, we can levy an additional mill levy on our local taxpayers to raise those additional dollars. Right. The problem with that is if every district in the state of Kansas does that, those mills in one community raises a different amount of money than they do in another community because of the wealth. Exactly.
And
so that's where the state comes in.
Maybe you can help me with this example. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but there was a school district, I think, down near Rawl in southwest Kansas. And this, by the way, I have to admit, it was a long time ago. Maybe it was. But at that time, they had swimming pools, they had high-level facilities at every location. And the reason for that was because of an irrigation economy, which hadn't been threatened as of yet, and of course the natural gas fields around Hugoton and Ulysses.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the valuation was higher, but with the depletion of the gas fields and more questions about irrigation generally, the economy, again, it's a moving target.
Well, just to give you an example, in Ulysses, my prior district, one mill would raise almost $400,000. And that's a community of 5,000, right? In Salina and Saline County, a community of 50,000, one mill will raise about $400,000. You know, so those dollars in southwest Kansas will go much further than they will in Salina.
Per student.
Simply per student, simply because of the property wealth that's there. So that's the inequitability. And so the Supreme Court came in and said, okay, when you did not adequately fund the local option budget, you are now required to do that. And they directed them to put the dollars in the local option budget and spread it across the state to make sure that all districts were kept equitable on their LOB. The other one had to be the capital outlay. And capital outlay is a different mill levy that school districts can adopt by virtue of a resolution, and those are also equalized. In other words, again, a mill levy in one community is different than in another, or a mill in one community raises so much more than in another. So again, the state needed to provide additional funding to level that. Well, in 2010, because of budget cuts, they took that away. And that's what one of the bases of the suit was that you cannot take that away because it damages school districts or students in poorer communities.
Yeah.
So the court ordered then you have to reinstate the capital outlay funding, the state funding.
Right.
So in those two areas, they provided the equity. Now in a larger issue, the Supreme Court said we don't have the right information to be able to make a decision, and that had to do with adequacy.
Yes.
And that's
a key point.
that's the big issue. That's
Yeah.
And that's the one that those 5 districts that had sued the state in the Gannon case really hung their hat on was that adequacy argument. And the court held in that particular argument that that adequacy, that the lower court used the wrong determinant in making that decision, and rather they said that they knew.
That is what constitutes an adequate
Right,
education.
exactly. What is
Kansas.
it? Right. And what is a suitable education, and what should our students know?
Yeah, which is the key language in the
In the Constitution,
Suitable
absolutely,
education, right.
absolutely. And so because they said that they used the wrong measure, they remanded that back to district court for further review. So that's something that's still out there. I believe it will come back in a year or so. It's not over yet. So for the purpose of 2506, they followed the court's order. And they put in I believe about $126 million
Yeah.
into the school funding formula, specifically in those two areas. But in the process of doing that, they also took from other areas in the education funding to do it. It's not like they just did a direct transfer and said, okay,
Yes.
here's $126 million.
Yes,
Use it.
and I think this is also a key point. And so do we have
Absolutely.
figures on how much of that actually was given by the legislature to fund it and how much was kicked or pulled
Well,
from other parts of the education budget?
Absolutely. The total amount was $126 million. Out of that $126 million, there were a number of other reductions on the school finance formula. For instance, they reduced the at-risk weighting for part-time students. And at-risk weighting, that students who qualify for at-risk are the students who qualify for free lunches. And so now they're basically saying that if you're a part-time student or if you're a student who's 19 years of age or older, we will no longer give additional at-risk funding to the school district for those students. And
Will
so-
that,
go ahead.
will that affect our kindergarten students since we're half-time students?
It says grades 1 through 12.
Okay.
Not kindergarten. So it shouldn't affect the
Okay.
kindergarten kids. But that was about $3.4 million there that they took out of a different part of the formula to fund
Yeah.
the $126
And
million.
wouldn't it be fair to say that those criteria more often apply to at-risk students, meaning there are going to be a larger number of those students who, that's money that is not available to them?
Absolutely.
It sounds kind of
Right.
reasonable to say, well, if they're half-time or if they're, if they're not able to afford lunches, then I think I've just talked myself into a corner, but go ahead.
But it seems
Yeah,
odd
yeah.
to me. No, I think you're exactly right where you're at,
Yeah.
David. I think your point's well taken
Yeah.
because it just seems contradictory that you would take away, that you would create inequity on one side
Yeah.
to establish equity on the other. You know, I mean, why
Yes.
are you creating
Yes.
an inequitable situation by taking dollars away from kids who most need them?
You can't rob Peter to
That
pay
makes
Paul.
sense. Yeah, it just doesn't
Yeah.
make any sense.
Yeah.
And so there's about $3.4 million there.
Well said.
They eliminated non-proficient at risk. Those are additional dollars that districts receive. It's for students who don't qualify for free lunches, but they're still not performing well on state assessments. So we receive additional funding for that to help those kids. They pulled those dollars away, and they also pulled away virtual weighting out of the local option budget. In other words, when you establish your local option budget, you no longer can count students in virtual programs to help establish that. So all told, that countered the $126 million. That was a reduction of about 11 or 12 million right there. And so, and plus they eliminated new facilities weighting for districts,
ask
which
this-
was important for us.
I'm sorry, facilities waiting?
New facilities weighting, and thankfully our bond issue passed recently.
Yeah.
But that would have been an issue for us moving forward because new facilities weighting is for any new buildings that are constructed as a result of a bond issue or even capital dollars, and you get additional new facilities weighting for 2 years from the state to help pay the operational costs.
So we lost that.
Well, as long as we passed the bond issue in April, we were okay. But after July 1, they're eliminating
we
it.
just scooted in
Under the line.
Well, thank you, citizens of
Well,
Salina.
and
for
understand,
that,
we
right?
communicated that pretty vociferously with our patrons that, you know,
Right, I remember
this is
that.
important. This
I
is
remember
important
that.
now because
Yeah.
in the future, a lot of those dollars that are available now may not be there.
Can we, just for a second, can we come
Absolutely.
back to virtual schools?
Sure.
I mean, those are the schools where students who are not making the regular classroom get online, but guided education, am I correct, in Salina?
That is correct. And we don't have we have virtual offerings per se where students can take a class or another, but really the only virtual programs we offer is for our adult learning program, and that's our diploma completion program that we just recently started. We had a conversation with the board a while back about having a virtual component to all of our offerings, and just felt at this point in time we really wanted to emphasize the importance of students having that face-to-face instruction.
Yeah. Which is another discussion we can have about the use of virtual education.
That's another show,
education.
Dave.
Yeah, I know, that's right. But we'll do our best with
Okay,
it.
all right.
Brandon, were you gonna add something?
I did have a question about the base state aid per pupil. They say it increased, but is it going to revert back in 2016, 17?
No, there were two different areas now. In the regular base, it was $3,838, $3,838. And what Brandon's referring to is the amount that every school district in the state receive for each full-time student enrolled. And right now it's $3,838. Part of the governor's proposal, and this actually was last year, this was approved last year because it was a 2-year budget, was increasing that by $14. Okay, that's not a tremendous amount.
No, it's not, especially given the cuts that we've had.
No, that doesn't bring a lot. I mean, for us, that brings in another $133,000 for next year, but that's $133,000 in a $45 million budget. I mean, it's not a lot of dollars, you know, but that's what that is. Now, what you're referring to also is there's a piece of it, Brandon, where they increased how the LOB is determined, and they increased that up to from 4433 up to 4554, I believe. And the net effect of that is that's going to bring in new budget authority of about $281,000, and so those are new dollars, and that's a good thing.
But it has to be voted in locally. Am I getting that right?
No, that's a different one. That allows that to happen. Now, if districts choose to increase the amount, the percentage of their LOB, then they can do so only if they get it approved by the voters in a mail-in election.
So would that increase our local taxes?
This one here, this won't increase our local taxes because the equitability, the dollars that they put into the LOB to make it equal, that more than anything else, that's new dollars. That's not new dollars for kids. It's not going to go in the classroom, but it's property tax relief. And so those additional dollars there, since the state's going to put in more there, that's less that we have to raise locally. So our local mill levy will go down to balance that. You know, so from that standpoint, it's good for property taxpayers.
It is, but it doesn't go into the schools.
Absolutely not. It doesn't go in the classroom, but it's good for property taxes.
Yes.
Locally, anyway.
You know, I'm betting that people who are watching even now get some sense of the complexity of the different issues, and it gives me some appreciation for what legislators have to stay ahead of or be aware of to make good decisions. But just that observation. Bill, are there other things in the funding that we should talk about? One thing I want to come back to is the private school allocation, but I don't want to jump to that if we're not. Have we pretty much looked at the effects overall for funding?
Well, yeah, and just for Salina USD 305, I mean, I can share well, what does this mean for our local school district?
Do that, yeah.
You know, in terms of dollars, because overall, when we start looking at the general fund adjustments, basically we'll get an additional $26,000 in the LOB that we just talked about. So we'll get about $300,000 new dollars, operating dollars. On the capital outlay side, that will bring in additional dollars, about $621,000. But again, the capital outlay is very rigid. You can only utilize those dollars specifically for upkeep and maintenance of buildings or purchasing equipment. You can't use it for teacher salaries, for instance.
Right. Which we think is important, right, Brandon?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Well, it is. It is important. I mean, I tell you, one thing that you guys had shared earlier, we talked about student achievement scores. It's such a contradictory situation. We're in the top 10 in the nation. When we start looking at our NAEP scores, that's the National Assessment of Educational Progress. That's given every year to 4th and 8th graders, and we're in the top 10 in the nation. Yet we're in the bottom 10 in the nation in terms of teacher salaries. You know, there's just something wrong with that picture. You know, and so from that standpoint, I mean, that is an important issue.
And that's another thing teachers are concerned about. I've had teachers ask me, should I go and get certification in some states? In other states, because of, you know, we're doing well on our testing, but you know, our pay scale is low, and now we don't have due process rights. Why not go somewhere else to where you can earn that? So I did have numerous teachers tell me that, and I was, you know, I'm like, no, don't leave. We need you, but at the same time, you know, why would I tell them to stay if they can go to another state and have some due process rights?
Well, it's complicated. I don't want to divert from the stream here, but one of the other pieces of this legislation was that it allowed professionals in particularly math, professional sciences and so forth to be just sort of, I think by virtue of the school district, certified to come in and teach without any teacher education whatsoever. I've heard a lot, for example, about Teach for America, and that may not be a comparable program because it's young people coming out of college. But the experience of Teach for America has been that idealistic young teachers will come in without teacher training and admittedly into some difficult situations as far as tough schools to teach in often. But nonetheless, they're typically gone within a year to 2 years, whereas the certified teacher who went through the process, percentages are much better for them. But the effect of the teacher that you're talking about, who is just thinking, do I stay in Kansas or not, he or she can be replaced very easily by a non-certified teacher. And that's not to take away from professional experience. Certainly that is valid. But I've known some professional people who were really lousy in a classroom.
Yes, sir. Well,
potentially and actually.
Yeah, I really feel that those foundational classes that you learn about early childhood development and classroom management, they're very important for teachers coming into the classroom. We can add, if we took a survey of substitutes that come in the building that may not have had any background, you know, some of them don't even last that long. I'm not saying that those people are not going to be good teachers. They may end up being great teachers, but it's some classes that I feel that is important for them to take. You know, if they want to come up with an alternative certification, that's fine. But I would like to see that we have to go back and take some of these classes. That, you know, because even as a teacher, in order for me to recertify, I have to go back to school and take classes. And most classes that teachers that I know, we take it that's going to help us in the classroom.
And I think you and I both know that walking into any individual classroom at any time, you're looking at an entirely different set of circumstances on any given day.
Yes, sir.
And from year to year, you'll have classes who come in who have certain characteristics. Would you agree?
Yes, sir.
We won't say anything about that or comment on that locally. But still, and you have to have as a teacher and as a human being flexibility, the ability to identify with students. And some of that's native, but it can be cultivated in teacher classes. It's not, educational statistics, I still remember that nightmare of a class. Oh my Lord, I think I escaped from that with a B. But nonetheless, I did learn something about being able to more appropriately evaluate students. So anyway, it still is important to have that. Can I ask one, it strikes me, and I'm trying to remember, and maybe you can help me with this. What's the state status now under the new law of negotiations for salary each year?
The collective bargaining process, it's still in place. That
Okay,
hasn't
collective
changed.
bargaining is.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So we still, like in USC 305, we still have our negotiated agreement, and we're in the negotiation process right now. So that's what we have.
Well, what's interesting about that as well, and with the changes in the due process law, right now it's still really early. And no one really, I mean, there's a lot of legal interpretation that's happening right now. And I believe there's going to be some litigation before it's all said and done related to, okay, what does this mean? And what are some of the key issues related to due process and due process rights for teachers? It doesn't impact the collective bargaining agreement, but one area that it does focus is it really, and it does go back as it places that, what they say, the local control back on the local school board. But that's always been there. I mean, the Board of Education has always had the final determinant in that, except we've always had the due process hearing in place. Well, now we don't have that. I know those who voted in favor of that legislation said, well, yeah, but teachers still have protections. Well, they say they have protection from constitutional issues. You know, for instance, if a teacher feels like they were being dismissed or terminated based on gender or based on race on any of those protected classes, they could still certainly have due process rights there. But in visiting with some other attorneys in the last 35 years, you can count on one hand the number of cases that were brought forward due to that reason. And typically there are other reasons that cause that, and that's the protection that teachers no longer have. You know? And so there's just a lot of legal issues that are going to come out of this, and I think it's going to be some time before we really determine the ramifications of this.
So I want to share a personal story along that line. When I had been teaching for at least 10 years at Cloud County Community College, I need to quickly do the math, probably more than 10 years. But at any rate, at the beginning of the first Iraqi war, 1992 was it, or 94, which probably, you know, obviously for you younger people out there, this dates me, but nonetheless, a group of us, a group of citizens in Salina from all kinds of backgrounds, teachers, a banker, professional people, farmers, were concerned about that, and we got together, and there was a Support the Troops parade. We weren't going to do anything particularly about that, but were known as actively questioning what the reasons for this were. They had the local Support the Troops parade, and because of my previous activism with this group, there were threats on me personally that I should not show up at that parade. And I didn't show up at that parade. We found a nice quiet place to be. But what ran through my mind was that thanks to the protections I had for freedom of speech, and this was not, by the way, that I propagandized students in the classroom, but since it was a pressing issue of the day, I tried to encourage them to have conversation in the classroom. I can't emphasize enough, we didn't focus on just that. But it wasn't a classroom, and anyone could come in and say, look at what they're talking about there. Without this due process, I might have not had a job. And if I do say so myself, I had something to add as an instructor. So I feel it personally, and I'm thinking that for teachers who really want to have these kinds of discussions, which are vital in a classroom, that this chilling effect that you referred to may be there.
Yeah, I think about just different IEP meetings, you know, we're trying to develop plans to help kids in the classroom.
Right.
You know, we have the parents there, we have the administrators there,
Right.
we have the counselors there. We're all sitting at the table trying to come up with a plan to help a student.
Very democratic process.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I'm in there trying to advocate for the kid. What if the parent doesn't see eye to eye with what I'm saying? I see them every day, you know, many hours throughout the day, and I'm saying one thing and they don't agree. You know, they go to, you know, they come back and have another meeting with the principal, or go to the Board of Education. You know, all these different scenarios can come in place, and it's really harmful to the education as a whole, because I'm here to advocate for the kid. I'm not saying that your student is not cutting it, or, you know, you're doing a bad job, but trying to come up with a plan to help them. And you know, without the due process, we may, you know, if you see a parent starting to grumble or make a wrong face, you might stop talking.
Are they going to show up at the board meeting and say, we demand that Mr. Cheeks be gone?
Yeah, hopefully not. Don't do that.
I know, yeah, that's right.
Don't give anybody ideas.
And, you know, I think I can share this story, and I will not identify, but a teacher a few years ago I talked to in the Salina school system, and that teacher had used social media as a form of outreach to respond to students. He had made some comment to a female student which she took incorrectly and thought and misinterpreted what he was saying. And she came, in this case, the student came in with her parents, if I recall correctly, and I may not be getting this, but the basic outline is the same, that he was getting criticism, and without administrative staff who supported what he was doing, even with that due process in place, he was concerned about it. So we don't need to hammer on this all night, but still, I think it's so important.
Yeah, I like Mr. Hall, if you can help just clear up some misinformation I've seen out there. Some people that's for this bill say, well, it was too hard, or we couldn't get rid of bad teachers in the classroom. In my experience, I felt that if a teacher wasn't cutting it in the classroom, you could still let them go. Could you just kind of explain that process?
The process is in place, absolutely. I mean, even with tenure, even with due process, it doesn't say that that you're incapable of removing an ineffective teacher. Right. And that's not what that's about. It's about affording a hearing in the event that if a teacher has secured tenure rights, they have a right to that hearing, and to ensure that the documentation is in place to be able to verify poor performance. You know, and so that due process doesn't say that you cannot get rid of a poor performing teacher, but you know, whether I as superintendent of schools for 305 or Mr. Cheeks as the president of Salina KNEA, or any of our Board of Education members, I will tell you we all share the common goal. And the common goal is that due process is there to protect high-performing teachers. But at the same time, and we see it in the news media all the time, that there are teachers that make poor decisions and do bad things. And in the event that we have those, there needs to be the mechanism to be able to remove those teachers.
Right.
But the due process was already there to be able to do that. So
Part of that process too, Bill, correct me if I'm wrong about that, but if I recall correctly, there was a process to, at least the way it was practiced where I was, to talk to instructors after an evaluation about whatever was seen as negative. And they would have opportunity to meet those standards, to talk openly about it with administration.
Correct.
That's another vital part of that, besides just the hearing, I think.
sure, I mean, the whole key of our evaluation process is to help our teachers become more effective. I mean, that's the real issue. It's not, our evaluation process isn't in place for termination. Now, at the same time, if we don't see the improvement that we need to see, that's the mechanism that we have for that. But we really focus on what can we do to help our teachers become more effective in their profession.
Right, right. I want to share, I think this is germane to the conversation. I happen to, I'm trying to decide in my own head whether to identify him on air or not, but I ran into a well-respected member of the community today, happened to be having coffee, writing down notes for this very thing, and I asked him what he thought about education today and the bill. And I wonder if I can find it, because this really is a good quote. Okay. There has been, he said, an erosion of the middle class and an increase in poverty. And in all of this, which is undeniable if you look at the economic trends, in all of this, this ability for upward social mobility that the schools have seen before is rendered less and less an option by the kinds of changes that we're talking about in public education. And teachers, and it must be said, administrators and the whole school apparatus, often get blame if they're not meeting those scores in the No Child Left Behind issue, the circumstances under which those students, from which those students come, and you refer to those pretty eloquently, Brandon,
yes,
in how every teacher has to deal with it, but that student goes home with their family and their parents, and not to slight the family and the parents, but people under tremendous economic and social stress, it's hard for them. And where is that? And I think that's a larger issue. Where are we in education? When the state, for example, with higher education has gone from 50% of higher education funding to 25 in less than 10 years. You know, what kind of commitment does the state of Kansas not have? And this bill writes it in spades, I think. Well, I'll shut up. What do you think?
Just personally, as you're talking about state testing, I think state testing is good, you know, kind of see the progress of the student from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. But some of the issues I do have with state testing is we go back, we look at the data, we look at the numbers after the fact. I know just thinking in one particular student in my mind, we looked at his test score and it went down. And the kid was a bright kid.
Yeah.
We started thinking, what happened? What went on? Why did he go down? And it was because his family had a divorce take place.
Yeah.
You know, we know kids that parents, they might have got arrested the night before.
Right.
And they have to come to school, take these tests. We know they come from low poverty. If they come to school late and, we're giving them, letting them go to the cafeteria in the morning, go ahead and eat, and then come and take the test. You know, we see these things, and we look at this, and, the funding just kept going down, and then we come to this bill, 2506, that was supposed to increase the funding in the classroom, and the numbers are just not there. The kids are not getting, the ones that really need it, they're not getting what they need.
At-risk students being reduced.
Yes, and that really hurts me, and it makes me feel sad. I just think about it. My kids. I know every night I'm going to be able to have time to go over their homework with them and make sure they did everything. But some families don't have that option because they have in a single parent home, and maybe mom has to go to work and they can't be there. So we have great after school programs, even at my school, Lakewood, throughout the city, to help these students. But it's just really sad that we're gonna go and try to hurt the teachers because we have to fund the kids. So let's give one to the teachers.
Yeah.
So.
And it must be said, from an administrative perspective, at least I'm seeing this, you have to evaluate. You have to know whether good teachers are doing well in the classroom. How do you do that? Through this testing or not? So Well, can I throw that in your lap? How does administration decide that?
I wish I kind of had the answer to that. No, I tell you, it's a difficult process, and we do have evaluation systems in place. And I mean, you hit on part of it earlier. I mean, absolutely, our administrators need to be skilled in what effective instruction is, and then and be able to transfer that and communicate that to teachers to help our teachers become better at their craft. I mean, extremely important. And we have a lot of the training in place for our teachers and our administrators to produce really high quality teachers. Now, not all of our teachers can get to that bar, and then we do everything we can to help them get there. But now there's kind of, I don't know, Brandon had mentioned it, but I know we have the United States Department of Education waiver, flexibility waiver that the state of Kansas now is looking at renewing. But a vital component of that is tying teacher evaluation to student performance. And that's an interesting conversation. I mean, I sat on a state committee that talked exactly about that, and they were looking, okay, what does this look like? Personally, I am not in favor of tying a high-stakes, one-time test to the effectiveness or performance of a teacher. I think a state assessment, just a one-time test, I mean, my gosh, the student may be having a bad day, So if we're going to go down that road, it has to be a system of multiple measures. It can't be one assessment. It can be a locally developed assessment. We have a number of local assessments that we use for kids right now. So you look at a compilation of data. You don't just look at one determinant to decide, how is this teacher performing.
And I want to tell you that you have my empathy in the administrator and other administrators do as well. When you look at the issue, for example, of the Common Core, which escaped being put in this bill, but the idea that there are federal standards, there are national standards, I should say, national standards that students have to meet. And I don't want to get into a long discussion about that, but my point that I think pertains here is that Kansas, there's been a lot of sentiment that Kansas will establish its own standards for what is taught. And, on one hand, I have some sympathy for that. I would confess to being torn about where to go with that. Sure, you want certain standards, but there's been a lot of furor generated by people who I think are not necessarily in favor of education, but ironically enough, want their stuff taught in the classroom.
Well, and what I would like to do is visit with those folks and see what is it that they want taught in the classroom that the college accredited standards are not offering. Because I tell you what, I've heard all kinds of war stories about the college and career ready standards. Everything from it's a government conspiracy to it's brainwashing to it. And I really challenge folks, before you can do that, before you make those statements, at least read the standards. Read what's in them, because I haven't found anything in there that's specifically insidious, and that is some type of a conspiracy theory going on. I mean, one standard might be we want our kindergarten kids to be able to count to 100 by 10. I don't see anything in there that's going to really corrupt a child. You know what I mean? So it's just important that people understand that before they make some of those arguments. And then I would say, if you have a different set that you'd like to see taught, as opposed to what are those? And because there are some things that we can't teach.
Yeah, and that's why we have, at least allegedly, local control through the school board. And by the way, that you mentioned that earlier, and I want to come back to another point which I think seems sort of hypocritical, that there's this discussion in the due process issue that they want local control of the administrators over teachers to be able to let quote-unquote bad teachers go more easily. But they want that local control, but they also passed bills that took away local control for controlling the carrying of weapons in buildings, including public schools and city-county buildings, for God's sake, or entering into payroll deduction agreements with their employees, which affects NEA folks, or even, I believe, who can speak to the legislatures, to the legislature.
Yes.
This kind of double standard, local control, when it's to our standard, what we want, then fine, but otherwise, forget about it. Troubles me. Okay, so do you want to weigh in on that?
That's another issue I have when we say more local control, and I think about, we can't do payroll deduct. It had some issues there about, making sure you not having any money for politics out of the payroll deduct when we donate to our different funds, KPAC or whatever.
And explain, right, Brendan, that this was once automatic, that those dues came out of your check automatically to go to have your teachers' representatives go to the legislature to represent all teachers.
Yes.
Right? And then what happened? Explain that.
We cannot give any money. If we do payroll deduct, they cannot have any money go through the school system that's going to go to political action. Because
it is a heavy weight on the school system to take the money out, right?
Yes, and it's
even though, by the way, they did it for years.
Yes, and it's a major problem.
We want to ask him to weigh in on that.
Yeah,
well, go ahead, because you're right. I mean, we've been doing it for you. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we, those funds wasn't going to. We were just, use those funds to go and interview potential candidates. I've interviewed all of the representatives that ran here in the last election in the primary, and I interviewed them just to see what their viewpoints are and make sure that they're pro-education. We wasn't looking at anything else. We're just making sure that they believe in education, great public education, and we'll just let the people know these people are gonna, they're gonna do what's right for the kids in Salina. So I guess that was the problem. But we want more local control, so we just
and this, by the way, comes to that one of those national issues. Because from groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council and the Americans for Prosperity, they have had what they call public employee choice acts. Now, Kansas, by the way, of course, as you know, is a right-to-work state. And sometimes you'll hear people who are critical of teachers who are saying, well, that they need to get rid of the bad teachers. I didn't have that protection. They see teachers, and perhaps they are privileged in that sense, but I would argue that that is a privilege that you would want for a teacher who is teaching your kids to have some sense of insulation rather than being say you can be gone tomorrow.
Yes.
But this right to employee choice is handy terminology for being able to imagine, for example, Brandon Cheeks going in and saying, I think I deserve a $5,000 raise, which, by the way, is not a bad idea.
Yes, thank you. I like that.
Yeah. But you go into not with Mr. Hall, but with the negotiations team, whoever it might be, and say that, well, yeah, good luck, buddy. But if you go in collectively and say, here's what we think is fair, that makes a whole lot of sense. And again, comes back to a democratic process that we value as citizens. In that same vein, let's talk about the $10 million that was granted to corporations to give scholarships, and I put those words in quotes, to special needs students. Do you want to give us some background, either of you, on what was that all about?
Okay, and actually, I assume you're referring to the corporate tax credits for the donations that corporations make for scholarships. And it's not for special needs students, but they earmarked it for students who are attending schools that are high poverty schools, that are identified as Title I focus or priority schools. But the issue on that is that it allows corporations to donate up to $10,000 in terms to provide scholarships for students currently in a public school to be able to attend in a private school.
And I think I want to check this: $10,000 per student.
Actually, I think the scholarship, as I was reading through it, is $8,000 per student in scholarships.
Okay, $8,000 per student
a year.
And I think that the state limit on that then is $10 million to the state treasury.
Total amount, total. Yeah. And I say in lost. I say lost revenue, and the reason it's lost revenue is because those corporations who make those donations will get a tax credit for that amount. And so in effect, it's basically funneling dollars from public sources into private schools.
And isn't it 70% tax write-off that they get?
I believe that's accurate.
That's it. So 7 of those dollars, they give that money to students, and 7 of every 10 of those dollars comes out of the taxpayer's pocket that the corporation can then give. That is, it's money that the corporation is not paying in taxes.
Correct.
That then is supplanted. That probably troubles me about as much, besides the due process issue, as much as anything else. Because, in my view, and speak to this, but yes, it sounds good, doesn't it?
Well,
You want to help out students? This gives corporations the right to be free,
Yeah.
to choose who they want to do, to send it to. But they're sending them, I would assume, to their schools to learn their curriculum. And they choose who those students are. There was an article recently about Walmart donating, giving $3.1 billion, I believe, over a period of $3.1 billion in education toward charter schools that are going to teach their kind of curriculum. And I'm summarizing greatly here, but of course the education they want is for their employees to be able to stock shelves and not talk back. Now, I'm exaggerating perhaps, but they shape the curriculum where they are. Any thoughts on that?
You want a response on that? Yeah, I tell you, David, and I also have real concerns about that, and because you're funneling dollars from public sources into private schools.
Yeah.
And as I shared with you before we went on air, I mean, I'm a product of, I went to a parochial grade school.
Right.
Actually, I was an administrator my first year in administration at a parochial high school. And so I've been on that side of it, and I understand that, and that's fine. As a parent, you make the decisions that you want to make that you believe are in the best interest of your children and of your family. Right. And you have the right to do that. You know, however, along the way, there's nothing that states that public dollars should be expended for your choice. And so consequently, I have a concern anytime the legislature, either at the state level or even at the national level, starts talking about the concept of using vouchers, using dollars to fund private education, because I believe public sources need to stay public. And the concern that I have with that is private schools within that same bill. There was no stipulation in there that required them to practice non-discrimination. In other words, they can pick and choose whom they want. Yeah. You know, or if they don't want, they don't have to take you. You know, you have to be. They don't necessarily have to be participating in state assessments. They don't necessarily have to be accredited. And so the only issue that I have with that is if you're going to use public dollars, then all schools need to be held to the same standards. Yeah. And you can't have a separate set of rules for public schools and not require those same things for private schools.
Right, and I'm thinking, Brandon, of your example earlier about the IEP, about your sitting down with parents and so forth.
Sir.
That process is required for every student. They have to be guaranteed a good education to the best degree that you can provide it. And that's what the individual educational performance plan, that's what that is. So that has to be there. And so to the point, they may, in a private school, they may do an IEP, but they're not required to meet some of the perhaps more difficult barriers that you might meet.
Now, we still provide for students in private schools that have IEPs. The public school provides support.
Which is interesting, yes.
For those students.
Talk about that.
And we do that because, you know, we want to make sure that every student, and the Supreme Court's held that every child, irrespective of whether you're attending a private school or public school, if you have special needs, you should have access to federal dollars to assist you in meeting the goals that you've set and that the team has set for you. So we still do that right now, you know, for special needs students. But beyond that, and again, I don't want to make it sound like I'm anti-private education. I'm not. I was kind of raised in that system.
I have grandkids who are privately educated.
And you know, but the issue is the philosophical issue of intermingling of public dollars to support private schools.
Yeah. There is so much to talk about in that. Yes, I have to share one of the things, along this thing about the gift from corporations and so on, maybe you may have seen this. Last Sunday on CBS Sunday Morning was the story of a millionaire. His name is Benjamin Olwine. He's 92 years old, and he goes to the Peachtree Restaurant in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And Melissa Maynor was his waitress, and he nice guy, and he struck up a conversation with Melissa and so forth. She was going through school and having a hard time studying to be an RN. He says, well, you know, for your tip, Melissa, bring me your tuition bill. I'll just pay it. And not only will I pay that, I'll pay all your tuition bills all the way through. And if you get past that and want to go on for a graduate study, I'll do that. And she did. And this is a great, heartwarming story. And it's great, you know. I feel good. I just felt wonderful watching that. But then what about all the other students who were taking the nursing training? And what about the millionaire who adopted a Harlem school and said, I'm going to pay all of your tuition, one class. All one class is taken care of. So this kind of largesse comes into the sort of naming opportunities. Now, Benjamin Olwine wasn't wanting his to be the Olwine Scholarship Fund, but when large pockets of wealth are concentrated, they can build stadiums with partly private money, football stadiums, you name it, and you get the Kauffman Stadium, and you can name them.
Yeah.
So you leverage private dollars for, public dollars for private ends while you're making a significant contribution. That whole thing, there was a column recently in the Salina Journal, so I won't even talk about that. But nonetheless, it's troublesome if we don't have a collective consciousness. So we've got about 5 minutes. Let's talk. What are your observations generally about what's the state of education? What do you want to talk about? What trends? How can we reverse the things we've talked about? Or how can we capitalize on the things that are doing well?
One thing I ask everyone to get registered to vote and get out in an election and vote and become informed about just all the different things. My heart is for education, so I really hope that everybody votes pro-education. But the most important thing, vote. If we have a great 80-90% voters turnout and whoever's in Topeka, then I can live with that. But when we have low turnouts and all these things happening that's affecting the students in the classroom, that really hurts me. I really want them to increase the funding, make sure the funding gets in the classroom, not everywhere else, and you have all these different calculations and you can manipulate the system. Make sure we're getting some money in the classroom for the students also.
And it's interesting to note, and it would be amiss if we didn't point this out, that in the mail ballot for the schools here, even though it was opposed editorially in the Salina Journal, we had what, 16?
At 52%
52%.
turnout.
52%
52%
turnout. Normally you get maybe 13 or something like that in a special election, which tells me that the will of the people really was reflected in that. But we can't have mail-in ballots everywhere. As you point out, Brandon, you have to have people who are willing to get to the polls.
Yes, sir.
It does take more to do that. And of course, beyond that, citizenship, as we teach our students, is more than just voting, right?
Yes, sir.
Bill?
Well, I tell you, and I'm concerned about what's happening, and I've said this before publicly. I believe the public education's under attack. I'm concerned with that for a variety of reasons. I mean, you don't have to look any further than House Bill 2506 to get a gist of what this means. I mean, in each of those areas, just a few points on that is that even though they increased the base state aid, they took away from other areas, so they created inequity in one area to solve inequity in another. Yeah. And why would you do that? I mean, why would you just not put the dollars in to solve the equity and keep this in place? Right. So what does that say about that? What about the fact that even with the additional local funding, school operating budgets are still increasing at less than the rate of inflation? And they have been since 2009.
Really?
So that has not increased. What about the additional funding that they did put in place, as Brandon mentioned, that expires in 2 years if it's not approved by local voters on the LOB side.
Yes.
So consequently, what happens if that goes away? And then finally, the legislature, they ended with the news. They said we put $126 million in the school funding. At the same time, when state revenues now are $90 million lower than expected in April. Yes. And so our revenues are declining. And so it's concerning about what's going to happen. And then they put in the policy things with the due process, the eliminated due process rights for teachers, and then the issue about creating a commission to establish efficiency in school districts. And I mean, all these things are really point to the fact that, is public education under attack here? And it's concerning to me. It's concerning to me as somebody who's devoted 32 years of his life in public education as a career.
And thank you for that.
And it's a concern. It's a concern. It really is.
Well, and we would be remiss if we didn't point out that the huge hole in the Kansas budget that the legislators are dealing with was caused by this tax with 191,000 companies who no longer have to pay income tax. And I think we have to note at the end of this, and this is not a rant against the governor, it is simply pointing out what I've read in the news, that the governor escaped a group of teachers in Hays who were outside the interestingly enough, Sternberg Museum, where they were talking about dinosaurs, when he says he doesn't believe in evolution, which is a whole other story. But then in Lawrence, when he's at being at a fundraiser, I think, and you can maybe help me with that, and teachers were outside, and he went out the back door. If you're going to do that, at least come in and face the music. At least give voters a chance to see. You need to justify what your votes are. And then we need to vote for those people based on whether or not they are supporting public education or not.
Yes.
We got 2 minutes left. Any final words?
I'd just like to thank you for having thank you for our, we have a great Board of Education that's very supportive of our school system and teachers. Our superintendent, he's pro-education, so we're excited about that. Just get out and vote, I don't think I'm supposed to say names, but one of our representatives, she is great. So make sure that you continue to support her.
Yeah.
So.
And as Brandon shared, and we're very, very fortunate in USD 305 because we have outstanding leadership beginning with the Board of Education. Great teachers. I mean, Brandon Cheeks is a good example of that. I mean, he's Master Teacher of the Year for USD 305.
High five.
We have outstanding teachers in our school system. We're very, very fortunate. It's just really important. And I appreciate, David, that you've asked us to be here because I'll tell you what, I will make myself available anytime to talk about education because I'm absolutely passionate about that. Yeah. And it's important that we really increase the awareness of our patrons, of our parents, about the impact that some of the decisions that are being made will have on their kids. And so it's important. And so I appreciate the opportunity to come on your show and talk about that.
I greatly appreciate both of you being here. This conversation has met every expectation and exceeded them. Thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So much for this session of Who Op.